Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Madeline. I am an interpreter here at the Charles Lindbergh House and Museum. And today I am here to present to you our Snapshot Saturday, Birds Rather Than Airplanes. Charles Lindbergh's childhood home has history that reaches much farther back than Charles himself. The site that the house now sits on has been used by humans for thousands of years. There is evidence that human activity of the site goes back over 12,000 years. Sorry about that. Archaeologists at the site have discovered artifacts that indicate that in addition to today, the site has had two distinct periods of occupation. In the last few thousand years, the land has belonged to several native nations. The land was originally utilized by the Dakota until Ojibwe tribes migrated to the territory. The land was utilized by the Ojibwe until 1847. The United States government purchased the land in order to form a reservation centered in Long Prairie for the Ho-Chunk tribe. In 1855, however, the Ho-Chunk sought to leave the land that was forced upon them. The land was ceded back to the United States government and opened for settlement. In 1898, Charles August Lindbergh, or CA, purchased 110 acres of land. The historic site today served as a catalyst for Charles Lindbergh's love of conservation and the environment. When the historic site was going to be open to the public, Charles wished for it to be a spot for families to come and enjoy the nature of the park. CA built a 3-story home on the land, along with other buildings such as a barn, ice house, and tenant farmer's house. In 1905, the 3-story home burned to the ground. On the existing foundation, CA built a smaller 2-story home. C.A. Lindbergh married Evangeline Lodge Land in 1901. In 1902, Charles Augustus Lindbergh was born. The family lived in the 2-story home during the summers. In winter, the family would live in Washington, D.C., where C.A. Lindbergh was an elected congressman. Charles's love for nature was hereditary. His father, C.A., also enjoyed spending time in the outdoors. As a child growing up on a Minnesota homestead, C.A. was tasked with hunting and fishing to provide his family with food. This resulted in him spending vast amounts of time outdoors, where he developed a deep appreciation for nature. C.A. later reflected, quote, "School didn't even exist until I was 12 years old. Even then, I could not divert my attention from nature to books." This love of nature and experience in the outdoors would come to benefit C.A. when he went to the University of Michigan to pursue a law degree. C.A. funded his schooling by returning to Minnesota between semesters and trapping muskrats and mink to sell the pelts. When Charles was born in 1902, C.A.'s love for nature was passed on. As a child, Charles would love spending time outdoors and in nature. Even in his youth, Charles would see the effect of civilization on the environment, stating, quote, "I think of my father's stories about frontier days in the Midwest. Woods were full of deer, and the sky was often black with duck when he was a boy. He had seen a bear run through his schoolyard. One generation later, I never saw a deer in the woods around our farm. Duck seldom rested on the creek or river, and bear only existed in the stories my parents read or told to me." Eventually, Charles would see this on a national scale, saying, quote, "I was struck and depressed in flying over the West by seeing fences come in and the wilderness breaking up. I flew close to the ground then. I sometimes chased wild horses with my planes, and I could see how civilization was taking over the West." Up until the 1960s, Charles never took much direct action in environmentalism. It took a catalyst to turn his love for nature into action. That catalyst came in 1961 at a conference on moral rearmament. Charles did not feel strongly about the topic of the conference or the group's leader, Frank Buckman. Charles felt that the, quote, MRA is made up largely of people who have been unable to solve their own problems and who, therefore, have gone out to solve the problems of mankind. Though not interested in the MRA, Lindbergh grew close with one of the attendees of the conference, a Kenyan Maasai warrior named Jilin Old John Conchala. The two men became fast friends. Charles was interested in civilization's impact on John's, quote, primitive tribe. John invited Charles to come see for himself and see his way of life in Kenya. 1 year later, Charles took John up on his offer and visited Kenya in the fall of 1962. Charles spent several weeks in Kenya on his first trip, touring with game warden Ian Grimwood and living with John's tribe. Charles fell in love with Africa. He would return many times over the next decade, first alone, then with his wife, eventually inviting his whole family. While there, Charles was asked to use his influence to try and expand tourism in the area. As a board member of Pan American Airlines, he urged the company to make Nairobi a hub city to increase travel to the continent. In his numerous travels to Africa, Charles contemplated the question he had originally asked John. In 1964, he wrote an article in Reader's Digest titled, Is Civilization Progress? In the article, Charles recounts experiences he had in Africa. He wrote, quote, what contrast in power between one of the great nuclear warhead rockets I had worked on in America and the wan, slender profile of a Maasai's weapon. Yet, both are effective instruments of warfare in the year 1964. And for half an hour on that Kenyan plain, I found the spear to be the more impressive. Throughout the article, Charles doesn't answer the titular question. However, Charles gives his thoughts on if civilization is truly progress by stating, quote, the final answer will be given not by our amassment of knowledge, or by the discoveries of science, or by the speed of our aircraft, but by the effect our civilized activities have upon the quality of our planet's life, the life of plants and animals, as well as that of men. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, Charles assisted in conservation efforts all over the globe in collaboration with many well-known conservation organizations. He took interest in the IUCN, or the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. As a Pan American Airlines board member, Charles flew all over the world, which he was able to use to his advantage. While traveling, he sent reports to the IUCN that cataloged countries' exotic animals and lists of government officials sympathetic to conservation. Charles also assisted the World Wildlife Fund, a subsidiary of the IUCN, and eventually became a board member. Throughout this time, Charles spoke out on many occasions to protect wildlife around the world. One species Charles worked heavily to protect were whales. In the 1960s, commercial whaling had pushed many species of whales to endangerment. Charles first wrote to the governments of the USA, Japan, and Peru, asking them to ban whaling in an attempt to save their populations. When this did not have the desired effect, he traveled to Peru and met with the president to discuss whale conservation. Charles soon found out the company whaling off the coast of Peru was located in Minneapolis. After this revelation, Charles sent a letter to the company's chairman. Charles's dedication resulted in a ban on catching endangered species of whales for 2 years. Another area that caught Charles's interest was Indonesia, specifically the Ujung Kulon Peninsula. In 1967, Charles traveled there along with members of the Indonesian government and spoke on the importance of conservation. Upon leaving, Charles found that the government had begun taking conservation measures and increasing poaching penalties. Today, the peninsula is a reserve, which is home to the last few Javan rhinoceroses. Charles also used his fame and friends in the US government to benefit conservation. In 1964, Charles was made aware of plans to build a United States air base on the island of Aldabra, a breeding ground for rare species such as the giant land tortoise, green turtle, and flightless rail. Charles took action and wrote to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, to consider alternate locations for the base. Charles's dedication to the preservation of endangered species resulted in the United States military moving its base. During the Vietnam War, Charles heard that US soldiers were shooting animals and sending them home as trophies. In response, Charles called the Army Chief of Staff. Eventually, the Army prohibited US soldiers shooting wildlife in Vietnam. Perhaps one of the most notable impacts that Charles had on conservation happened in 1968. Charles had heard news that a bill protecting the Arctic wolf population in Alaska were set to fail. Charles quickly organized a trip and gave a speech to the Alaskan legislature, his first public speech in 27 years, defending the bill. In subsequent, the bill was passed. One representative called it, quote, "nothing short of a miracle." In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Charles took many trips to the Philippines. The first time Charles went to the Philippines, he went with the intention of spreading awareness for the tamaraw, a small buffalo native to the nation. Charles succeeded in his goal. A reserve was created to protect the tamaraw population. While there, Charles also learned of the monkey-eating eagle, also known as the harpy eagle. Charles, along with Filipino scientist Dr. Dioscoro Rabor, succeeded to establish protections for the eagle through the Monkey-Eating Eagle Conservation Program in 1969. For his accomplishments, Charles would be awarded a presidential plaque of appreciation from the President of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos. During his trips to the Philippines, Charles would become involved in another organization, PANAMIN, or the Presidential Assistant on National Minorities. PANAMIN sought to protect the culture and identity of the various native groups scattered throughout the Philippines. Charles would spend the next few years occasionally traveling to the Philippines, eventually becoming one of the organization's directors. During one trip, Charles would encounter the supposed uncontacted Stone Age tribe of the Tassidae. Eventually, a reserve would be created around the Tassidae lands. Later, questions arose around the legitimacy of the Tassidae tribe, and it was ultimately revealed as a hoax. PANAMIN was dissolved at the end of President Marcos's administration in 1983. Today, PANAMIN is often viewed as a corrupt organization run by President Marcos's companions in order for land developers to move indigenous populations and exploit its natural resources. However, it is likely that Charles did not know this at the time he was a member. During his life, Charles played a role in establishing many parks, the first only a few years after his historic flight. In 1931, Charles and the rest of the Lindbergh family deeded over the 110-acre family farm to the state of Minnesota. Charles hoped the land would be used as a park. It was eventually established as a state park in 1931, where it remains a state park today. However, the boyhood home was later transferred to the Minnesota Historical Society and turned into a museum. In the late 1960s, Charles would assist in the formation of another Minnesota park. In 1969, Voyageurs National Park had not been founded. It was just an idea that many prominent Minnesotans were pushing to succeed. A former Minnesotan himself, Charles was asked to give his support for the park's foundation. Not wanting to support something he had not seen himself, Charles visited the land along with the head of the Minnesota Historical Society, Russell Fridley, and former Minnesota Governor Elmer Anderson. On his trip, Charles flew a seaplane over the proposed park and took a boat to assess the land. After seeing the land himself, Charles decided to support the project, saying, quote, "It would make one of the world's great national parks. It is one of the most beautiful and attractive areas I have ever seen. It seems to me it would be a tragedy to miss the opportunity of establishing it as a national park." Due to the support of numerous legislators and Charles's public support, the bill to establish the park was passed in 1971. Charles would continue to support parks in the United States even until his death. On the island of Maui in Hawaii, Charles was active with the Nature Conservancy, an organization dedicated to obtaining beautiful pieces of land and giving them to National Park Service. Charles sought to preserve as much of the Hana coast as possible. He died there in 1974. Charles's dedication to conservation did not end with his death. It was continued by his children, and eventually his grandchildren. Charles's oldest living son, John, made a career as a diver. While still alive, Charles commented on his son's path, saying that if he were young again, quote, "Many of the elements which attracted me to flying no longer exist. I think I would follow your footprints to the oceans." John became a scuba diver, exploring underwater caves in college, and eventually becoming a diver for the United States Navy. Later, John would take part in the Man in Sea project, staying at various depths and breathing a mixture of helium and oxygen. This would result in him officially becoming an aquanaut and advocating for further exploration of the world's oceans. Scott Lindbergh was also an avid conservationist, raising monkeys in France with his wife. Today, the Lindbergh name is still associated with conservation. The Lindbergh Foundation was established in 1977 with the goal to decarbonize aviation. The foundation offers prizes on achievements similar to the Orteig Prize Charles won in 1927. In 2027, the foundation's chairman, Eric Lindbergh, Charles's grandson, plans to recreate his grandfather's iconic flight in a carbon-neutral aircraft. If the flight succeeds, it will accelerate the pathway to net zero carbon aviation, a feat that would have surely made Charles Lindbergh proud. The boyhood home of Charles Lindbergh served as a catalyst for his love of nature that inspired his conservation efforts around the world. We at the Charles Lindbergh House and Museum invite you to come explore our grounds that may inspire you to engage in conservation efforts in your community and to combat climate change. Okay. And at this time, we are able to open the floor up to questions if anyone has any. Okay, and with that, we thank you for joining us.